Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers for the 6th legislative day of 2011. I'm Scott Slade, and coming up in tonight's program, the Senate overrides a former Governor Sonny Perdue veto on zero-based budgeting. We'll bring you an in-depth leadership interview with Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams. Senator Williams explains the reasoning behind the recent Senate power struggle. And we'll be joined by two in-studio guests to talk about issues surrounding Georgia's water needs. Senator Ross Tolleson, chairman of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and Sally Bethea, founding director of the Upper Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. We've got a lot to do for you tonight on Primetime Lawmakers, but first, a strong bipartisan vote in the Senate to revive a measure vetoed by the former governor. And Wandy Lawson has the details in tonight's Capitol Report.
For those of you who are freshmen, the budget that will be placed on your desk for your approval will likely detail as little as 3% of the next year's spending.
Senator David Schaefer went to the well this morning to encourage his colleagues to override former Governor Sonny Perdue's veto of Senate Bill 1 and allow the state to move to zero-based budgeting. What followed was perhaps the strongest showing of bipartisan unity this session.
In the governor's veto message, he talked about this does not change the budget process employed by the General Assembly, which could employ zero-based budgeting in its budget process under current law if it so chose. Could you address that?
Basically what he's saying is that when if you read the sentences before that, what he's saying is that before he submits the budget to us, that he does zero-based budgeting. He just doesn't show us his zero-based budgeting. And what he's saying in that portion of the message is that if we really wanted to know, we could just ask. I'm saying that as part of the process, the agency heads and the governor ought to show us everything that they propose to spend in the upcoming year and ask for our approval. Not show us only a tiny percentage and then say to us, if you've got any questions about the 97%, just ask.
The Senate's longest-serving member, Democrat George Hooks, recalled that zero-based budgeting had been used when Jimmy Carter was governor. The system, he said, would prevent state agencies from hiding money from the legislature.
This agency, for example, there's a position that has been vacant for over 3 years, but yet it's been annually budgeted in the salary of $32,412 a year since it was vacant. Now, what the agency has done is keep that $32,412 a year and spend it. Now, I'm not saying anything illegal went on. Of course, it did not. But it's been a vacant position for over 3 years that was done away with. This tool will allow us as a legislative branch to get into it. I think it's good fiscal policy. I understand the governor's veto message, but frankly, I don't agree with it. If it worked under then Governor Carter and it went away during the years, I think it's a good principle of fiscal responsibility.
Without dissent, the Senate voted to override the veto of SB 1. Now, that override requires a 2/3 majority vote by the House to become law, and that won't be easy to come by. House leadership say they have their own version of zero-based budget legislation and that HB 33 is preferable over challenging the governor's office with an override.
I'm confident, though, that this House and this Senate has a very talented group of elected folks that can evaluate for themselves what might actually be a better bill than what SB 1 was. And my preference would be to go about it that way rather than the negative connotation of, well, we'll veto that and override it. And I mean, we'll override that veto and go forward.
Looking back on the week, on Monday, Senator John Bullock filed legislation to allow a referendum on local Sunday sale of alcohol. Senate Bill 10 would allow retailers to sell beer, wine, and liquor Sundays from 12:30 p.m. until 11:30 p.m. On Tuesday, Governor Nathan Deal presented his first Eggs and Issues address, pointing to an emphasis on job creation, water management, and schools.
I want to meet quarterly with groups of teachers, principals, local school superintendents, local school board members, and parents from around the state of Georgia.
And Wednesday, the Senate Finance Committee gave unanimous approval to Senate Resolution 20, the Taxpayer Protection Amendment of 2011.
It sets a limit on how much the state's budget can grow on a year-by-year basis. And essentially it says, the amount of money we spent last year is the most we can spend the next year, but we can adjust it up for inflation and population. So, of course, we know we have inflation. Population generally increases. So we would allow the budget to grow at a reasonable rate instead of sometimes when there's an enormous amount of money that comes in, lawmakers are tempted to just spend it all. this would say you can't spend above a certain amount, and if any excess revenue comes in, you're required to put that into the rainy day fund. And once the rainy day fund gets to a certain point, then we would actually begin reducing the income tax rate.
Faced with a budget shortfall of over $1 billion, it might appear that there would be little reason to consider what to do with surplus funds. Senator Rogers, though, says that Senate Resolution 20 is an investment in future prosperity.
When the economy has another downturn like we've gone through the last few years, we aren't in such terrible shape by not having enough money in reserves. Now, look, we had about $1.8 billion in reserves, which was the most ever. But had we, during the 90s and maybe during 2004, 5, and 6, really put aside some money, then we would have been in even better shape. So this is just a constraint of the people telling their lawmakers, look, there's just a limit to how much you ought to be able to spend in 1 year. And if you bring in excess revenue, you need to put it aside or you need to send it back to the taxpayers.
SR 20 is now in Senate rules awaiting consideration by the full Senate. Reporting from the Capitol, I'm in Wandy Lawson for Primetime Lawmakers.
And now to tonight's leadership segment. Wandy sat down yesterday with Senate President Pro Tem Tommy Williams, who says the state does not have to wait out the recession to begin improving the unemployment picture.
I'm working with some of our freshmen to drop a bill right now that spreads out over time your unemployment insurance premium factor. You know, if you've got a loss over the last 3 years because you had to lay off people, your premiums go up. It doesn't take into consideration the many years of good experience you may have had. So spreading that average out will lower those insurance premiums. I've got businesses that are saying, Senator Williams, we're going to have to lay off people because our unemployment insurance premiums are going up too high. So those are the kind of changes that we can make. There are a number of other bills out there that help business, the premium tax, any number of bills that could help businesses be a little more profitable so they could put a few more people on.
And now there's the joint House-Senate Tax Committee considering those recommendations that came down from the Tax Council on reform and fairness. And I'm wondering, in this session, what do you see as being kind of the role, perhaps, for some of those recommendations and maybe some of them becoming legislation?
That team worked very hard, and we think they did a pretty good job at bringing us a group of solutions that create jobs and that changes our tax structure, give us a little more stability and collecting taxes. I like a lot of their proposals, and I think at the end of the day we'll put together a package of those proposals that we can bring to the General Assembly for a vote.
Any ones in particular you want to note that you do like?
Well, I like the idea of putting the tax back on food and taking it off income. As long as you do it's revenue neutral and it's not a tax increase. It's taking from a lot of folks who frankly are not paying taxes. Tourists are not paying taxes on food. Illegals are not paying taxes on food. Transients coming through. A lot of folks that just shop from our border counties are not paying taxes on food. It's taxing that and giving the break to the Georgia citizens who are paying income tax. We have provisions in there to take care of the poor, those low income wage earners, and also anybody that's currently on food stamps, those are not taxed. So I think that's a fairer, flatter tax that we should consider.
Any chance for that moving forward during this particular year, or is that something that you think we need to look at over a longer period of time?
Well, if it needs to be done, I don't know why we can't do it this year. Obviously, we have to look at our budget, what our needs are there, what of this we can do. If we address premium tax, you know, that costs us some money. Inventory tax is another tax that hurts our ability to recruit big box companies. Warehouses that would come into Georgia may not come because we have an inventory tax that they have to pay at the end of the year. So those are the kinds of things that will create jobs and give our businesses that we're trying to recruit a reason to come to Georgia.
Governor Deal told reporters yesterday that he is proposing $300 million over the next 4 years to improve the water infrastructure here in Georgia. And I'm wondering, what do you see as being the way that some of this money might be used and prevent perhaps federal intervention into the matter?
Well, the the governor has a great spirit about him. I mean, he's a good negotiator. He's a very friendly person, an endearing kind of guy, and he's already met with the governor in Alabama. They're having great conversations about how to solve our water wars with Alabama and Florida. He's the kind of person that, frankly, I think can get us to an agreement there, which certainly will help with our issue with the federal judge. But the money that's for infrastructure doesn't necessarily have to be only reservoirs. It takes a long time to build a reservoir. We're looking to contract with some cities and counties that may be ready to build a reservoir now, that we can just join them, that they're already part of the way through the permit process, which can take, frankly, years. There are other issues that digging wells, conservation, that we can do that are not necessarily reservoirs, but long term we need to be building some reservoirs and storing up water during times of plenty.
The Senate began changing some of its rules on the first day of the session, and those who oppose some of these changes say that things like creating the Committee on Assignments and some of the other rules changes are actually consolidating the power in the hands of too few. So I'm wondering what you see as perhaps being the benefits of these rules changes.
Well, what's been portrayed is this is all personality and power grab. The fact of the matter is not. It's simply about obeying the Constitution. Every year, every senator in here, including the lieutenant governor, put their hand on the Bible and swear to uphold the Constitution. The Constitution says the powers of the lieutenant governor come from the governor, and that the powers that reside in the Senate and the House shall forever remain there. That's the words of the Constitution. So we believe that as a legislative body, it is our obligation to govern the legislative body, and he being the executive body, his power should come from the governor. Now, he is the presiding officer, and that is in the Constitution, and he will continue to be the presiding officer. He does a great job at that. He's a good man. We all like him. We just believe there's a separation of powers issue in the Constitution, and we need to abide by that.
We also heard from Governor Deal that he would like to see the Quality Basic Education Act, the funding formula for our public schools, changed during this session. I'm wondering what some of your opinions might be about that.
And let the locals pick up the administrative side. They'd be a little more interested in managing their money better if they were having to pay for the administration side. I like that idea. Yesterday I met with Apple Computers. Apple can come into our school systems at $500 per child, offer every child an iPad, put up a Wi-Fi system, train all the teachers, and provide all of our curriculum, and upgrade that system every 3 years. We're spending $45 million a year on books that wear out after 7 years, and there's no reason that we should not change our those kind of funding efforts to help kids learn the way kids learn these days.
So you're seeing a greater role perhaps for some private partnerships maybe in the future for education here in Georgia?
Well, we're still buying books and replacing them. We've got books that still have Pluto as the planet, as a planet. We have books that don't even have 9/11 as a matter of history or current events. We could, with an iPad, we can replace that as the event happens, and that's the way kids learn. So, particularly in middle school, where kids start to think about dropping out, they get behind. The evidence is where we offer that kind of learning, and the kid doesn't go home with a backpack full of books. They go home with an iPad, and the chances of them dropping out are lessened quite a bit. So we need to move that direction. Over time, it actually saves us money. So those are the kinds of innovations in spending that we need to be focused on. Our new school superintendent, frankly, has an iPad and thinks this is the way we should go. One of the other things that he believes, and I support, is everybody's not going to college, so we need a legitimate vocational track that allows folks to pursue a vocational track. And where we do that, particularly in career academies, where more kids are staying in school because they see school as relevant and they see it as a way to get a job.
Thanks very much, Imwandi Lawson. What a great interview with Senate Pro Tem Tommy Williams, among other things, thinking we ought to move ahead on tax reform. And iPads might be the solution for Georgia school kids to get them more motivated and save a bunch of money, too. Thanks so much. Depend on us to keep you up to date with what our leaders think throughout primetime politics in this legislative season. We're going to catch up with Tom Crawford, the editor of the Georgia Report, get his take on this second week in just a moment. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. It's the end of the legislative week, and that means it's time to check in with Tom Crawford, editor of the Georgia Report. I spoke with Tom earlier today, and we started by talking about the pace of the legislative session. It has been an interesting start to the legislative session, Tom Crawford. Kind of a slow start because of the weather, hasn't it?
That's right, Scott. We got off to a little bit slower start than we usually did, but I think the pace will pick up a little bit next week.
Bring us up to the speed of this power struggle between Senate leadership and Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle. What's the latest there?
The latest there was the Senate leaders, Tommy Williams and Majority Leader Chip Rogers, made another run at Casey Cagle earlier this week. They tried to pass a rules change that would have given Tommy Williams, the President Pro Tem, a little more control over the Senate staff and the budget of the Senate staff, which would have been a significant take back from Casey Cagle, but Casey worked some angles behind the scene, put off the attack, and he emerged a little bit stronger than he did before, still in control of how the Senate works.
And what does that mean, in control of how the Senate works? How legislation moves forward?
Well, and his presiding over the body, and also in the control of his own staff, really, and the budget and other administrative aspects like that. He's been able to recover a little bit from the setback he had a few weeks ago with the Senate's Republican caucus.
Meanwhile, even with all the distractions, the legislature is beginning to move forward to some hot-button issues, Tom. Let's start with immigration bills.
There were two immigration bills introduced this week, one in the House and one in the Senate, and they both were an outgrowth of that special House-Senate study committee that held several hearings back in the fall. The legislation is very similar to what Arizona passed last year in terms of giving the police more power to hold people that they suspect might be illegally residing in Georgia. If this bill is actually passed and signed into law, of course, everybody expects the federal government to step in, challenge it in court, and have it set aside until this whole matter is decided, maybe at the Supreme Court level.
Meanwhile, Governor Deal advanced his agenda in front of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce earlier this week. Eggs and issues, anything really new there?
Nothing really newsworthy. He said he's going to set up a number of task forces in things like education, water supply, business competitiveness, to come back with some new ideas that he might be able to try later on. This is really a way of buying time at a time when you don't have a whole lot of money to spend on new programs. You can at least make people think that you're still trying to move things forward. And I think that's what the governor's trying to do here.
And the Georgia Senate voting 52-0 to override Governor Perdue's veto. Now, bring us up to speed on that.
This was a bill that Governor Perdue, or former Governor Perdue, vetoed last year that would have required the state to go to what they call a zero-based budgeting process, which is basically a top-to-bottom examination of every dollar that a state agency spends. The Senate and the House both passed a bill last year that would require this zero-based budgeting. Governor Perdue didn't agree with it and vetoed it. The Senate voted today to override that veto. The House leadership indicated, well, we like the idea of zero-based budgeting, but we don't think we'll vote on the veto override. We'll try to pass our own version of the bill and see if that works out a little better.
Hot button issues, we mentioned immigration just a moment ago. Sunday sales, that appears to be moving forward.
There's a much better prospect this year to legalize Sunday package sales of alcoholic beverages. Governor Deal was asked again this week how he felt about the issue, and he said, if the legislature passes it, I will not veto it. That's a big change from the former Governor Perdue, who said he would veto a bill if it came out of the legislature. So with that roadblock out of the way, the prospects of getting a Sunday sales bill are probably the best that they've ever been around here.
Tom Crawford, it's great to catch up with you. Let's do this often.
Oh, we will. We will.
Even as the water wars between Georgia and surrounding states drag on, Governor Nathan Deal raised the issue of the importance of the water supply at Tuesday's Exit Issues Breakfast. Governor Deal says he wants to expand existing reservoirs and will call on the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority to coordinate state resources and help local governments find additional water supplies. Joining me in the studio live this evening is Senator Ross Tolleson, chairman of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and Sally Bethea, founding director of the Upper Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, an environmental advocacy group. Thank you both for being here. We'll be talking quite extensively in just a moment. But let's begin by taking a look at a clip from a recent documentary that aired on GPB, Chattahoochee, From Water War to Water Vision.
I call the Chattahoochee a blue-collar river. And by that I mean, you know, this river does a lot of things for many interest groups.
It's where over 6 million people get their water supply and send their wastewater. It generates electricity and provides cooling for coal, gas, and nuclear power stations. It supports agriculture, industry, recreation, and aquatic life. It belongs to everybody, those living upstream and those living down.
Let's begin this evening with the bear that's at the door, if you don't mind. The federal court ruling that gives Georgia another 18 months or so to cut a deal with Alabama and Florida over drinking water, especially from Lake Lanier. And Sally, let's start with you. Are we on track to satisfy the court, and what do you think ought to be done?
Well, we think we really need to get out of court and start negotiating with our downstream neighbors. We need cooperation, and we need to get a water sharing agreement so we can get access to Lake Lanier. We have a massive reservoir sitting there that we need to be able to use. We could even raise it 2 feet and get billions more gallons of water. That's what we'd like to see done. We're frustrated that to date our state leaders have not made much progress on negotiations.
Okay. Senator Tolleson, great to have you here this evening. What do you think?
Good to be with you. Well, negotiations have been going on for the last few years pretty hard. And a lot of the judge set aside that the negotiations pretty much had to be kept quiet and not in the public arena. So that's why you kind of sometimes feel like you wonder what's going on. Mm-hmm. But the three teams are all working very hard together. So we hope that there will be an agreement coming soon.
Former Congressman Buddy Darden in this program earlier this week, I asked him, was he aware of meetings going on between the governors of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida? And he answered more or less by saying, these first meetings should take place privately and out of the public eye. Have you heard of any such meetings going on?
Well, I do know they've had dialogue. And of course they have teams that are negotiating and have been negotiating for the last couple of years. So there's been a lot of hard work being done, and I think there's been a lot of progress. And I actually feel pretty confident that, you know, by the time the deadline shows up, I feel like there'll be an agreement.
Ms. Bethea, I mean, you said just a moment ago we need to come up with an agreement. So you're in favor of them talking to each other.
Absolutely, but we're also in favor of transparency. We feel that any agreement that is going to be made between all the states has got to be out in the open with all the sectors, all the affected people, industries and so forth, knowledgeable about what's going on. So there's buy-in to the ultimate agreement. We think that's an absolutely critical element, and we've been pretty frustrated at the lack of transparency to date.
Okay, well, perhaps some of those doors will open a little bit here
Hopefully.
as we get closer and they start talking publicly. Another issue here, a hot button issue in all this, is interbasin transfers. An AP story says rules adopted Wednesday by the Department of Natural Resources provides greater scrutiny on requests to take water out of one river basin, use it, and return it to another basin. Senator Tolleson, you've had a couple of comments about that. How do these these interbasin transfers work, and is that really a good thing to do?
Well, interbasin transfers occur in Georgia. This is not creating more interbasin transfers. These were rules and regulations that were put in place that actually were taken straight from the statewide water plan. And because we seem to not really be able to have a real adult conversation in the General Assembly about it and come to an agreement on a good bill dealing with interbasin transfers, by putting these into rules and regulations, it raises the bar on being able to have an interbasin transfer and creates more protection for the state. So actually today, we're better off than we were before we passed those rules and regs. It put in some more strength and more hurdles that you have to do before you have an interbasin transfer.
You agree with that?
Well, not really.
Is that workable?
Not really. The rule that the DNR board passed yesterday really has the appearance of regulation, but not the substance. The rule makes it totally discretionary whether or not our state environmental agency evaluates their permit decisions using a whole list of really important criteria. We're not opposed to moving water from one river basin to another. We know that's done in Georgia very often. But we think there needs to be a thorough review and analysis, science, technical look, and a look at the economic prosperity to make sure all downstream communities are protected and all rivers are protected. We need to see our Georgia EPD mandated to do this sort of review. We need certainty, and we think it'll be very helpful with Alabama and Florida to have a stronger rule, which is why we're now carrying it to the legislature.
As far as building new reservoirs is concerned, that's going to take a while. But Governor Perdue is pushing it, saying the longer we wait, the longer it takes. I mean, is that going to be
Governor Deal now?
I'm sorry, Governor Deal. What am I saying? Yeah, Governor. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, Governor Deal. We're talking about a lot of money here and a lot of time, but at least we'd control them, wouldn't we?
Yes, you do, and it does take time. It takes time to do all the environmental studies and do all the permitting and all that. And I think probably out of the gate, probably adding capacity to lakes will be our first real increase of supply of water.
Raising the level is...
That's right,
okay.
raising the levels and adding supply in different reservoirs, I think will be the first addition of supply in the state. And I think that it'll take years to get other reservoirs online.
Conservation. Everybody can argue that it's always a good thing to conserve our natural resources, but would this help us in our negotiations with other states?
Well, I think absolutely, and certainly Governor Perdue and the senator and others passed a strong Water Stewardship Act with conservation measures last year, but there's a lot more that can be done. And it's just smart for the pocketbooks of Georgians who are feeling the pinch of the recession and so forth now to invest in efficiency and conservation. Efficiency first is going to get you the biggest bang instead of new reservoirs. I completely agree with the senator that existing reservoirs, maximizing their use, that's the way to go instead of building new ones.
In a few seconds we have left, do you see stricter conservation laws being passed?
The bill we passed last year was good. It was strong. It's actually being used as a model across the nation. And you're going to see a lot of good conservation come out of that. The agricultural community was real big in helping out. Industry, sub-metering on new apartments complexes built after July 2012.
All things that'll help. Yeah.
You won't even be able to buy a plumbing fixture in the state of Georgia after 2012 that's not a water saver plumbing fixture. So there's a lot in that bill.
We'll have to
and
leave
it really was a strong one.
Have to leave it there for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. It's illuminating, and this is going to be a big issue. Obviously,
Thank you
appreciate
very
both of you
much.
being here. That's all the time we have for this evening. The General Assembly is not in session tomorrow, so primetime lawmakers will not be seen at 7. But please tune in for primetime politics. Tomorrow's program will explore the future of the Hope Scholarship. That's tomorrow night at 7 on GPB. When Primetime Lawmakers returns on Monday, we'll bring you another installment in our Leadership Interview series. House Majority Leader Larry O'Neill is scheduled to appear, plus in-depth analysis of important legislative issues and the latest Capitol news. Primetime Lawmakers returns Monday, January 31st at 7 p.m. See a repeat of this broadcast at 5:30 tomorrow morning on GPB. Coming up next, Georgia Outdoors. Thanks for joining us.
This is a GPB original production.
We're transparent.
That's because you requested.
County, when they stopped all the sewer taps in Gwinnett in the 80s, they stopped that building boom, bam, like
They
that.
were going to in the city of Atlanta in the 90s, but anyway.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
All right.
Great to see you, Sally. It's great to meet you, Senator. Sure appreciate it, and I hope to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, stay in touch. Just leave it there on the counter. It's fine.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right, Scott. Good to see you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.